Our destroyers crept into Surigao Strait.
October 25th, 1944, the Surigao Strait. In the dark hours before dawn, the Japanese battleships Fuso and Yamashiro are steaming north into the last gun battle between battleships the world would ever see. A heavy cruiser and 4 destroyers behind them, driving toward the American invasion fleet anchored off Leyte. Ahead of them, strung across the far end of the strait, waits a wall of warships they cannot yet see, and 5 of those ships are survivors of Pearl Harbor. Over the next 2 hours, the Japanese column will be torn apart by torpedoes and gunfire. Both battleships will go to the bottom, and an admiral will choose to die with his flagship rather than turn back. This is the story of the Fusō Class, the desperate plan that sent them up that strait, and the night that wrote the final chapter of the battleship. To understand why Fuso and Yamashiro were sent to die, you have to understand how old they were, and how proud Japan once was of them. Fuso was Japan's first super dreadnought, the first capital ship Japan built at home, from hull to guns, even if the designs behind them still owed a debt to British yards. Until then, Japan had bought her heaviest ships from British yards, or built them to British designs, and even her first home-designed dreadnoughts had leaned on imported material and weapons. Fuso was the break from that, a homegrown ship meant to announce that Japan could now arm her battle line without depending on anyone. She was laid down at Kure in 1912, launched in 1914, and commissioned in 1915. Her sister, Yamashiro, followed close behind, built at Yokosuka and completed in 1917. They carried 12 14-inch guns apiece, among the heaviest main batteries of any battleship afloat at the time, and for a few years they were among the most powerful ships in any navy. But they were built with a flaw that would follow them their whole lives. Their 12 guns sat in 6 twin turrets, and instead of grouping those turrets neatly fore and aft, the designers scattered them down the length of the ship in an awkward pattern, with 2 of them planted separately in the middle of the hull. The scattered turrets stretched out the part of the ship that had to be armoured, which meant the armour had to be spread thinner to cover it all. The midships guns had poor arcs of fire and could barely shoot toward the bow or stern without blasting the ship's own structure. Fuso and Yamashiro carried a great weight of guns arranged in just about the least efficient way possible. In the 1930s, both ships were rebuilt, and it was during that rebuild that they took on the look they are remembered for. Their forward superstructure was built up into a towering, top-heavy tangle of platforms, rangefinders, and bridgework stacked 7 levels high, called the pagoda mast. On Fuso, it rose to something like 130 feet above the waterline, one of the tallest and strangest silhouettes ever put to sea. After their reconstruction, the Fusō class battleships displaced around 39,000 tons at full load and measured 698 feet. The rebuild raised their top speed to about 24.5 knots. They carried a main battery of 12 14-inch guns in 6 twin turrets, backed by 14 6-inch guns and 8 5-inch dual-purpose guns, along with 3 floatplanes launched from a single catapult. By the time the Pacific War came, Fuso and Yamashiro were second-line ships. Even after their rebuild, they could make only about 24 knots, when the newest battleships on both sides were closer to 30. Their armour was thin by modern standards, their guns outranged by newer designs. They spent most of the war in home waters, used for training and reserve duties, while the fast carriers and modern battleships did the fighting. They were, by 1944, ships the Navy could afford to lose, and in October of 1944, the Navy decided to spend them. By October 1944, Japan was losing the war, and the American invasion of the Philippines threatened to cut the home islands off from the oil and resources of the South. The Imperial Japanese Navy responded with a plan of enormous complexity and enormous desperation, a single, all-or-nothing operation to smash the American landings at Leyte. It was called Shogo, and it committed nearly the entire remaining fleet. The plan split the Navy into separate forces, converging on Leyte Gulf from different directions. The main striking force, built around the giant battleships Yamato and Musashi, would come through the San Bernardino Strait to the north. The last of Japan's aircraft carriers, almost empty of planes, would sail far to the north as bait, to lure the powerful American carrier fleet away from the landing beaches. And a third force, the southern force, would push up through the Surigao Strait to strike the invasion fleet from below, catching the Americans between two arms of a pincer. The southern force was given to Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, and it was built around Fuso and Yamashiro. Nishimura had the two old battleships, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers. His task was to force the strait in darkness, break into Leyte Gulf, and fall on the American transports. It was a hard assignment for any force, and Nishimura's was neither fast nor modern. But there was a second problem that would prove fatal, and it was a problem of coordination. A second Japanese force was also heading for the Surigao Strait that night, a group of cruisers and destroyers under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima. The two forces were supposed to support each other. They approached from different directions, kept to separate schedules, and were never placed under a single command. Nishimura would enter the strait well ahead of Shima, and he would fight the battle essentially alone, with Shima trailing too far behind to help. What Nishimura was steaming toward was very nearly the perfect ambush. Waiting at the northern end of the Surigao Strait was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commanding the bombardment and support force of the American 7th Fleet, and he had used the geography of the strait to lay a trap that every naval officer dreams of. The strait was a narrow funnel. Any force coming up, it had to come in a long, thin column, ship behind ship. And across the top of that funnel, Oldendorf laid his line of battle broadside on, stretched from shore to shore. This is the maneuver naval officers call crossing the T. The enemy comes on in column, able to fire only with the forward guns of the leading ship. It concentrates the entire firepower of one fleet against the head of the other. It had been the dream of admirals since the age of sail, and here, in this strait, the shape of the water itself was going to hand it to Oldendorf. His force was overwhelming. He had 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and nearly 30 destroyers, and below them, scattered down both sides of the strait, 39 fast torpedo boats waiting in the dark. And there was something fitting about the battleships he commanded, something that gave the night ahead a weight beyond the tactics. 5 of his 6 battleships had been at Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th, 1941. West Virginia and California had been sunk at their moorings and raised from the mud. Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania had been damaged in the same attack. They had been pulled up, repaired, modernized, and sent back to war, and now they lay across the Surigao Strait, waiting for the Japanese fleet to come to them. The ships Japan had tried to destroy at anchor were about to get their answer. And Oldendorf's battleships had one more advantage, the one that mattered most in the dark. Their newest ships carried fire control radar that could find a target and lay the guns on it in total darkness, at ranges where the Japanese could see almost nothing at all. Nishimura's force was already hurt before it reached the trap. The day before, American carrier aircraft had found the southern force in the Sulu Sea and attacked, and Fuso had taken a bomb hit that wrecked her catapult and her float planes. Nishimura pressed on regardless, on schedule, into the mouth of the strait. A little after 10:30 at night, the American torpedo boats found him. They came darting in out of the darkness, firing torpedoes and racing away, and though they scored no hits on the heavy ships, they did the one thing that mattered most. They radioed back the position, course, and speed of the Japanese column. From that moment on, Oldendorf knew exactly where Nishimura was, and exactly when he would arrive. Nishimura, pushing on up the strait, was steaming blind into a force that could see him coming. Then the destroyers came. Around 3 in the morning, the American destroyer squadrons swept in from both flanks of the strait and launched their torpedoes into the Japanese column out of the blackness. This was the attack that broke the back of Nishimura's force before the battleships had fired a shot. At about 3:09, torpedoes from the destroyer USS Melvin struck Fuso on her starboard side. The old battleship heaved, caught fire, and lost speed. More torpedoes found her in the dark. The flooding spread through her hull, and she began to settle by the bow and list hard to one side. She fell out of the line, burning, and within about 40 minutes she rolled over and went down, her spilled fuel oil catching fire on the surface as she sank. She took most of her crew with her. Of nearly 2,000 men aboard, only a handful would ever see Japan again, perhaps as few as 10. The same wave of torpedoes that doomed Fuso shattered the rest of the screen. Of Nishimura's 4 destroyers, 3 were torpedoed in quick succession. 1 blew apart, 1 was sunk outright, and 1 was crippled and left behind to be finished later. Only a single destroyer, Shigure, would survive the night, a ship already famous in the fleet for surviving battles that destroyed everything around her. Nishimura's force had been gutted, and he had been given every reason to turn back. But Nishimura did not turn back. He drove on up the strait toward the American line. Yamashiro had taken torpedo hits of her own by now, but she kept moving. Whether Nishimura even knew that Fuso was gone is unclear. At one point, he signaled the missing ship to take station on him, calling for a battleship that was already at the bottom of the strait. Either way, he led his 3 remaining ships straight into the waiting guns. At around 10 minutes to 4, the American line opened fire. The cruisers along the flanks fired first, and then the battleships. The first to find the range was USS West Virginia, using her radar to lay her guns on a target she could barely see in the dark. Her opening salvo of 16-inch shells struck Yamashiro at a range of more than 22,000 yards. California and Tennessee, with the same modern radar, joined within minutes, and then the whole line came down on the lone Japanese battleship at once. It was less a battle than an execution. Yamashiro steamed into a storm of shellfire from ships she could not properly see, crossed at the top of the T by the entire American line, every gun bearing on her, while she could reply with only her forward turrets. Shells came down on her in salvo after salvo. Witnesses said she burned from end to end, glowing like an open furnace in the dark, and still she came on, still firing back, refusing to stop. For a few minutes, the weight of fire was so great, and so many American destroyers were loose in the strait, that Oldendorf had to order his own ships to check fire to avoid hitting their own. But there was never any doubt about how it would end. A little after 4 in the morning, a fresh torpedo attack struck Yamashiro and brought her to a halt. She lay dead in the water, burning, hammered by gunfire, and then she rolled over onto her side and sank. She took Vice Admiral Nishimura down with her, and almost the whole of her crew. Like her sister, she left only a scattering of survivors, and when Admiral Shima's second force finally arrived, hours late, it came upon the burning wreckage of Nishimura's command, understood at a glance that the battle was already lost, and turned around and withdrew. As the action died away and the American line checked fire, one battleship, USS Mississippi, got off a final full salvo at the retreating enemy at a range of nearly 20,000 yards. Those shells, fired into the dark at a beaten and withdrawing foe, were the last salvo ever fired by one battleship at another in the history of the world. No battle line would ever again fire its great guns at another. The form of war that Fuso and Yamashiro had been built for died with them in the Surigao Strait. The numbers tell the scale of it. Nishimura's southern force was annihilated. Both battleships, the heavy cruiser, and 3 of the 4 destroyers were sunk, and more than 4,000 Japanese sailors died in the strait. American losses amounted to a single destroyer badly damaged, caught in the crossfire of her own side, and a handful of men killed. It was among the most one-sided victories in the history of naval warfare. For the few who survived the sinking of the 2 battleships, the ordeal was not over. Many of the men in the water refused to be picked up by American ships. Some who reached the shore of Leyte were killed there. Of the nearly 2,000 men who had sailed in Fuso, only about 10 lived to return home. Yamashiro's survivors were nearly as few. An entire battle division, 2 capital ships and their crews, had been wiped almost completely from existence in the space of a single night. The Battle of the Surigao Strait was one of 4 linked actions fought around Leyte Gulf in those days, and together they destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. But Surigao holds a place of its own, because of what ended there. It was the last time in history that opposing fleets of battleships fought each other with their guns. The maneuver that decided it, the crossing of the T, was the oldest dream in naval tactics, perfected at the exact moment it became extinct. Oldendorf executed it flawlessly, and in doing so, he closed a chapter of warfare that had ruled the seas for 300 years. The aircraft carrier had already taken the crown. Surigao was the funeral. There is a grim symmetry to how it happened. The old battleships that Japan had once been so proud of were sent up a narrow strait to be slaughtered by battleships Japan had tried to sink at Pearl Harbor and failed to keep down. The ghosts of that December morning crossed the Japanese T in the dark and collected a debt 3 years old. Fuso was believed to have blown in half, her magazines exploding in a single blast that left 2 burning halves drifting down the strait. The discovery of her wreck, lying upended on the floor of the Surigao Strait, told a quieter story. Not a magazine blast, but torpedoes, flooding, and a slow roll into the dark. She and Yamashiro came to rest not far apart, the sisters that shared a design, shared a career, and died on the same night within sight of each other. For 80 years, their stories were so tangled that historians could not always say which one broke apart and which one burned. But it hardly matters now. They were built for the same navy to fight the same kind of battle, and in the end, they were lost together for a plan that had already failed. They had been built to rule the seas, and they were sent out to die on a night when the seas already belonged to someone else. When they went down in the Surigao Strait, the age of the battleship went down with them.